Steamworld Heist is a turn-based strategy game where you command a squad of 1 to 4 robot mercenaries in assaults on various enemy spaceships. The game uses some light procedural generation for the layouts of the ships and the enemy placements. The majority of the combat is played out through gunplay, with a heavy emphasis on ricocheting bullets off of walls and objects to reach enemies behind cover or otherwise outside of a character's direct line of sight. As you complete heists, your crew members will gain experience to unlock new abilities, and you will also earn new weapons and tools, as well as water, the game's currency. The game follows Piper Faraday, a smuggler turned bounty hunter who begins to fight back against the local outlaws, out of concern that increased law enforcement attention will also put her operation in danger. Along the way, you recruit several other robots to your cause and eventually take the fight to the local oppressive government regime itself. There's not much to the plot, and the game doesn't spend much time with it, which is good. It doesn't go out of its way to try to evoke reactions from the player, and just uses the story to establish the game's setting, which is deep space, except with cowboys. Except everybody's a robot. Except some robots run on steam and others on oil, and those ones are assholes. The game's selling point is more about its mechanics. When engaging in a raid on an enemy ship, you command each of your crew to move and attack. They will automatically take cover against any object you move them next to, and cover objects can be shot through when a character is positioned next to it. You can also move up to double a character's normal mobility, but this prevents them from taking any action afterwards. When firing, you control the character's aim manually, with some added waver to make taking precise shots more difficult. Sighted weapons will also show the bullet's course, ricochets and all, which can be very useful for complex trick shots. After ordering all your crew members, any activated enemies will act as well. Only enemies that are in rooms you have already opened will move, so it's important to make sure you're prepared before opening a new door. Enemies are pretty uniformly aggressive. They'll almost always go for whatever shot is available to them and don't do much to take strategic positions. The AI isn't bad, per se, save for a lack of caution with and around explosives, but it is pretty predictable, which can be a problem for a strategy game. Which is not to say the game is necessarily easy. I started the game on the highest difficulty setting, Elite, because I'm such a smart and talented boy, just like my mommy says. I had a challenging but enjoyable time with the game's first act, but when I got to the second act, I couldn't get anywhere. Each new room I opened would have 5 or 6 enemies in it, any of whom could knock off half a character's health with one shot, and having very limited cover to push ahead safely. And the open vertical layout of the rooms, with lots of walkways which can be shot through, often makes finding effective cover in these large rooms impossible. That's a problem I have with this game's room-by-room combat engagements. The ideal strategy, especially in higher difficulties, is to only open doors at the very beginning of a turn and try to wipe out all the enemies in it before they get a chance to act. It makes small room encounters feel kind of pointless next to the nigh insurmountable large room encounters. Many times the difficulty of this game just feels frustrating rather than challenging. After bashing my head against that particular wall for a while, I swallowed my pride and moved down 2 difficulty levels to Experienced and had a much easier time. There was still a lot of emphasis on wiping out as many enemies as I could before they could act, but the penalty for failing to do so was much less harsh. And then I got to the third act, at which point the game got a lot easier. Maybe too easy, though that was more due to the growth of my characters than the battles themselves getting easier. As you use each available crew member, their repertoire of abilities will increase. The game does a really good job of giving each character distinct and useful abilities. While each character needs to be used in just such a way to get the most out of them, it almost never feels restrictive. Likewise, the game's missions aren't really distinct enough to warrant any specific party being suited to any one of them. There are a few special mission types, such as a timed run through a map or a single room survival, but most are just go to A and do B. I don't consider that a problem though, as it further allows you to use whichever crew members you want, and the game's mechanics are solid enough for these simple missions to still be fun. But while your crew members get stronger and more capable as the game goes on, the enemies really don't. There aren't many enemy types other than the standard rifleman, and what few there are aren't used very often. What's worse, many of the special enemy types are actually easier to deal with than the standard ones. Many of them rely on some special quirk to their attack or movement to set them apart from the vanilla foes. A lot of them could be really challenging to deal with, but they would require very specific positions and room layouts for that to truly be the case. And that can't really happen because the enemy placement and room layout is randomized. All in all, I don't feel the game benefits at all from its procedural generation. The randomized maps feel pretty interchangeable, and the random enemy and cover placement prevents the game from having many really interesting encounters. The bosses, for example, are really cool. The specific layout of the rooms and more deliberate enemy placement makes them really cool and interesting fights, but there are only 3 of them in the game. Like I said, the core mechanics are good, even in the more standard fights, but there aren't many interesting things done with enemy placement and room layout, which I think would have really improved the game. The game looks pretty good, the backgrounds are nice, and the rooms are well detailed. There are a lot of colorful, interestingly designed characters, but the animation is very simplistic. I don't really hold that against them though. Enemy designs are all distinct enough to tell each apart while still keeping to the theme of each foe's faction. And the music is fine, but not exactly memorable, except for a few fully vocalized songs that play in the taverns and after defeating bosses. My score for Steamworld Heist is a 3 out of 4. It has well-designed characters, a very rewarding development system, and solid mechanics, but its randomized levels keep those mechanics from meeting their true potential, and it has some occasionally frustrating spikes in difficulty, and a somewhat annoying inverse difficulty curve overall. If you like turn-based strategy games like XCOM or Worms, it may be worth a shot. I recommend picking it up.